The first day of the apocalypse broke over the earth with a silence that belied the terror to come. Outside the crystalline walls of the safe cities, the unmarked, nearly 7 billion souls, awoke to a world unchanged in appearance but irrevocably altered in essence. The Nordics had promised a culling in phases, and as the sun crested the horizon, the initial phase began with a precision that defied human comprehension. For those who had received the mCEL vaccine, a ticking clock embedded in their cells reached its final hour. In Chicago, Sarah Martinez sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee trembling in her hands. She'd sent Tommy to Safe City 3 days ago, her unmarked wrist a quiet acceptance of her fate. The morning air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the city itself held its breath. Then it started, a tickle in her throat, faint at first, like the onset of a cold she couldn't shake. She coughed once, twice, the sound sharp in the stillness. Within minutes, the tickle became a rasp, then a relentless hacking that doubled her over. Her lungs burned, each breath a struggle against an invisible vice tightening around her chest. She wasn't alone. Across the street, Mrs. McMillan, her neighbor from the grocery store days, staggered onto her balcony, clutching her throat as coughs racked her frail frame. In the apartment below, a young man who'd once delivered Sarah's groceries collapsed against his door, his gasps audible through the thin walls. The mCEL vaccine, heralded years ago as a savior during the SARS-CoV-21 crisis, had been a Trojan horse, its alien nanotechnology lying dormant until this moment, activated by a signal only the Nordics could send. Sarah stumbled to her window, her vision blurring as she coughed up flecks of blood. The streets below erupted into chaos as others emerged, parents, children, workers, all marked by the same relentless sickness. Some fell where they stood, their bodies crumpling like marionettes with cut strings. Others clawed at their throats, their coughs a cacophony that drowned out the city's usual hum. Within an hour, the first deaths came, swift, merciless. An elderly man collapsing on a park bench, a teenager sprawled across a sidewalk, her phone still clutched in her hand. In Safe City 17, Tommy Martinez stood before the screen in his quarters, his small hands pressed against the cool surface. He'd resisted watching until now, but the telepathic nudge from the Nordics, an urging to bear witness, had finally broken his resolve. The glyph pulsed under his touch, and the display shifted from blank translucence to a live feed of Chicago. His breath caught as he recognized their apartment building, the camera angle hovering impossibly above the chaos. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking as he saw her silhouette at the window. She swayed, one hand braced against the glass, her coughs visible even from this distance. Tears streamed down his face as he pounded the screen, helpless to reach her. Around him, other chosen trickled into the hub, drawn by the same compulsion to watch. Some gasped, others turned away, but Tommy couldn't move. His mother's struggle tethered him to the image. In Safe City 42, Marcus Hawthorne sat at his desk, the wall-sized screen before him projecting multiple feeds from across the globe. London, Mumbai, Beijing. Cities he'd once manipulated through the ecliptic order now crumbled under the weight of the vaccine's betrayal. He watched with clinical detachment as a London street filled with coughing figures, their bodies dropping one by one. A mother clutched her infant, both unmarked, her cries silenced as she fell beside a stalled bus. In Mumbai, a market dissolved into pandemonium, vendors and shoppers alike succumbing mid-step. Hawthorne's fingers traced the edge of his glass, the scotch untouched. He'd known the mCEL program was Nordic technology, a tool the Order had wielded to thin the herd subtly over years. But this was no subtle reduction. The nanotechnology, once dormant, had awakened into a killing machine, targeting the vaccinated with ruthless efficiency. Billions had received it, trusting the Order's puppet scientists like Randy Dawsey. Now those billions paid the price, their immune systems collapsing as the alien code rewrote their biology. In Safe City 9, Nolan Husk stood among a crowd in the communal hub, the screen before them a mosaic of destruction. His analytical mind cataloged the patterns. Urban centers hit hardest, rural areas slower to show signs, the elderly and infirm dying fastest. Reykjavik's streets, visible in one feed, mirrored the scenes elsewhere. A fisherman doubled over on the docks, a teacher falling mid-lesson in a classroom, her students screaming as they too began to cough. The vaccine's reach was staggering. Nearly 6 billion had taken it during the orchestrated panic of SARS-CoV-21, a number Husk confirmed with a quick mental calculation. "It's systematic," he murmured to the woman beside him. the same one who'd asked if he'd watch. The nanotechnology, it's targeting respiratory function, overloading the system until it shuts down. She nodded, her face pale. My sister got it. She swore it saved her life back then. Her voice broke as the screen showed a suburban street where a woman, perhaps her sister, collapsed in a driveway, her coughs fading into stillness. Nolan's sigil glowed faintly, a stark contrast to the unmarked billions dying beyond the city's walls. He'd activated the display out of necessity, needing to understand the Nordics' methods. The images confirmed what the ecliptic order had hinted at. The vaccine wasn't just a population control measure. It was the first wave of the culling, designed to eliminate the majority in hours or days. The speed was breathtaking, the death toll already climbing into the millions as the morning wore on. Outside the safe cities, the unmarked who hadn't taken mCEL watched in horror as their vaccinated loved ones fell. In Washington, D.C., President Ronald Bosman stood in a bunker, his unmarked wrist trembling as he coughed uncontrollably. Beside him, Lark Ferguson mirrored his struggle, both men among the billions who'd received the vaccine during its global rollout. Their fight against the order had spared them no mercy. Ironic, given how they'd exposed its manipulations. We should have known, Lark rasped between coughs, his voice barely audible over Bosman's labored breathing. Dossie, he was their pawn. Bosman nodded, sinking into a chair as his strength waned. We fought the wrong war. His eyes fixed on a monitor showing the capital's streets, where Secret Service agents and civilians alike dropped like flies. The bunker's air filters couldn't stop the inevitable. The nanotechnology was already inside them, triggered by the Nordics' silent command. In Colorado, Eli Rogers sealed himself deeper into his bunker, his unmarked wrist free of the vaccine's curse. He'd never trusted the mCEL program, a choice that now spared him this first wave. Yet he knew the Nordics had more planned. His survival was a temporary reprieve. On a scavenged radio, he heard panicked reports of cities falling silent, the vaccinated dying en masse. Not yet, he muttered, checking his rifle. Not my time yet. Back in Safe City 17, Tommy's sobs grew louder as Sarah's silhouette vanished from the window. The feed shifted, showing her slumped on the kitchen floor, her chest still as the coughing ceased. He sank to his knees, the screen's glow casting his tears in stark relief. Around him, others cried out, names, pleas, curses, as their own loved ones appeared and faded on the displays. The Nordics offered no commentary, only the raw, unfiltered truth of their work. Marcus watched a counter tick upward on his screen. Hundreds of millions dead within hours, a number that would soon hit billions. The vaccine's efficiency was a testament to alien ingenuity, a weapon humanity had willingly injected into itself. He leaned back, his detachment fraying as the scale sank in. This was no controlled reduction. This was annihilation. Nolan turned from the screen, unable to watch another family dissolve. 6 billion, he said quietly, the estimate rough but chilling. That's what they'll take today alone. The woman beside him covered her face, her sobs joining the growing chorus in the hub. The first day stretched on, the coughing sickness claiming lives with relentless speed. Streets filled with bodies, homes became tombs, and the unmarked who'd avoided mCEL clung to a fragile hope, unaware that the Nordics' next phases loomed. Inside the safe cities, the chosen bore witness, some transfixed, others turning away, but all carried the weight of a world dying beyond their walls. The apocalypse had begun, and the mCEL vaccine was only the opening act. The second day of the apocalypse dawned with an eerie stillness, the air thick with the aftermath of the mCEL vaccine's lethal purge. Nearly 5 billion had perished in the first 24 hours, their bodies littering streets, homes, and fields, a silent testament to the Nordics' precision. The unmarked who'd avoided the vaccine, roughly 2 billion strong, clung to a fragile reprieve, their relief shattered as the next phase began without warning. The Nordics had promised a phased culling, and on this day, they unleashed a plague that echoed the darkest chapters of human history. A modern Black Death, engineered for annihilation. Outside the safe cities, the first signs appeared in the early morning haze. In rural Nebraska, where the Peterson family farm once stood, Tom Peterson staggered from his barn, his unmarked wrist free of the vaccine's curse, but now marred by a new horror. Black spots bloomed beneath his skin, small at first, like ink stains, spreading rapidly across his arms and chest. A fever gripped him, sweat soaking through his shirt as his breath grew shallow. He coughed, not the relentless hacking of the vaccine victims, but a wet, gurgling sound that heralded something far worse. Within hours, the plague's symptoms escalated. Tom's lymph nodes swelled grotesquely, bulging under his jaw and armpits like dark, festering knots. Pain seared through his body, and his vision blurred as delirium set in. He stumbled back to the farmhouse, calling for his daughter Katie, who'd also escaped mCEL's reach. She met him at the door, her face paling as she saw the black lesions creeping up his neck. "Dad, what's happening?" she cried, reaching for him. "Don't touch me," he rasped, collapsing against the wall. Blood trickled from his nose, staining the floorboards. Around them, the rural quiet shattered as neighbors emerged, farmers, families, survivors of the first day, all bearing the same marks. The plague spread like wildfire, airborne and merciless, its origins unmistakably alien yet hauntingly familiar. The Nordics had resurrected the Black Death's legacy, amplifying its speed and lethality beyond anything humanity had faced in 1346. In Chicago, the remnants of the city's unvaccinated population, those who distrusted the mCEL rollout, faced the same fate. Aaron Sullivan and Nadia Greaves, holed up in their suburban hideout, had spent the first day documenting the vaccine deaths, their unmarked wrists a temporary shield. Now, as dawn broke, Aaron felt a chill that wasn't from the drafty windows. She rubbed her arm, frowning as a faint dark spot appeared, then another. "Nadia," she called, her voice trembling. "Look at this." Nadia turned from her stack of journals, her own skin beginning to darken with the telltale lesions. "Oh God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Within minutes, both women were gripped by fever, their bodies trembling as the plague took hold. Coughs racked their frames, blood flecking their lips, and their swollen glands pulsed with agony. The archive they'd fought to preserve slipped from their grasp as they sank to the floor, the room spinning around them. The plague's reach was global, striking urban slums and remote villages alike. In Mumbai, marketplaces fell silent as vendors and buyers collapsed, their skin blackening under the relentless sun. In London, survivors who'd barricaded themselves in tube stations succumbed, their cries echoing through the tunnels. The Nordics' design was ruthless. Airborne transmission ensured no one could hide, and the accelerated incubation meant death came within hours, not days. Bodies piled atop those felled by mCEL, a second wave of carnage that spared neither age nor strength. In Safe City 17, Tommy Martinez watched the holographic displays in the central hub, his tear-streaked face illuminated by the glowing feeds. The image had shifted from Chicago's vaccine-ravaged streets to a rural landscape he didn't recognize, Nebraska, perhaps. He saw a man, Tom Peterson, fall in a farmhouse doorway, his daughter Katie kneeling beside him as black spots consumed her too. Tommy's breath hitched, the memory of his mother's death still raw. "It's not stopping," he whispered to no one, the hub's other chosen too transfixed or horrified to respond. The screen flickered, showing multiple cities now, Paris, Nairobi, Sydney, all succumbing to the plague. A woman in a Parisian cafe clutched her throat as lesions erupted across her face, collapsing into her untouched coffee. In Nairobi, a child ran from a shack, only to fall mid-step, his small body overtaken by the black tide. Tommy turned away, burying his face in his hands, but the sounds, gasps, screams, the wet coughs, followed him through the city's sterile air. In Safe City 42, Marcus Hawthorne observed the feeds with a grim familiarity. The Nordics had warned the ecliptic order of this possibility centuries ago, during their first encounter amid the original Black Death. He'd known their technology could resurrect such a plague, but seeing it unfold surpassed even his hardened expectations. London's footage showed a street he'd once walked as an order operative, now a graveyard of blackened corpses. "Efficient," he muttered, his voice devoid of triumph. The counter on his screen ticked upward. Billions already dead from mCEL, now hundreds of millions more falling to the plague. He leaned closer, noting the precision. The plague targeted only the unmarked, leaving vaccinated corpses untouched. The Nordics' control was absolute, their phases orchestrated to maximize loss while preserving the chosen. Hawthorne's role as a leader loomed, but for now, he was a spectator to a massacre he'd failed to prevent. In Safe City 9, Nolan Husk stood among a growing crowd. The hubs displays a relentless panorama of death. Reykjavik's feed showed a fisherman he'd seen yesterday, now writhing on the docks as black lesions consumed him. The woman beside Nolan, whose sister had died to mCEL, gasped as Nairobi appeared, her hand clutching his arm. "It's everywhere," she said, her voice hollow. Nolan nodded, his mind racing to quantify the unquantifiable. The vaccine took 5 billion. This plague, it could claim half the rest in a day. His estimate, another billion, felt clinical, but the images defied detachment. A Sydney hospital overflowed with patients, doctors and nurses collapsing alongside the sick, their unmarked wrists no shield against the black tide. The Nordics biotech was staggering, airborne, rapid, selective, yet rooted in a horror humanity had faced before. In his Colorado bunker, Eli Rogers listened to the radio, static-laden voices fading as the plague spread. He'd escaped mCEL, and so far, the lesions hadn't touched him. "Dumb luck," he growled, checking his air filters. The reports painted a grim picture. Cities silenced, survivors dropping like flies. He knew the Nordics weren't done. This was just the second act. His rifle rested beside him, a futile comfort against an enemy he couldn't fight. Outside Washington, D.C., the bunker housing Ronald Bossman and Lark Ferguson had fallen silent. Both men, felled by mCEL on the first day, lay still, their bodies untouched by the plague ravaging the unvaccinated. The monitors they'd watched flickered with static, abandoned by technicians who'd succumbed to the black spots. The capital beyond was a necropolis, its survivors now prey to the Nordics' next weapon. In the safe cities, the chosen grappled with the spectacle. Some, like Tommy, turned from the screens, unable to bear more loss. Others, like Marcus, watched with cold analysis, preparing for their roles in the aftermath. Nolan stood torn, his intellect cataloging the plague's mechanics while his humanity recoiled. The hub's air grew heavy with sobs and murmurs, the weight of billions dead pressing against their crystalline refuge. The second day stretched on, the Black Death's echo claiming lives with a speed that defied nature. Streets became rivers of corpses, the unmarked falling beside the vaccine's victims. The Nordic silence was deafening. No voice accompanied this phase, only the screen's relentless testimony. Beyond the safe cities, hope dwindled as the plague tightened its grip, a harbinger of the even greater devastation yet to come. The third day of the apocalypse arrived with a roar that shattered the fragile stillness left by the mCEL vaccine and the engineered plague. The earth itself rebelled, its crust splitting open as the Nordics unleashed their most visceral phase yet. At precisely 8 a.m. Universal Time Coordinated, the Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped belt of tectonic fury encircling the Pacific, erupted in a synchronized cataclysm that defied natural laws. From Alaska to Chile, Japan to Indonesia, volcanoes that had slumbered for centuries awoke simultaneously, their molten fury joined by dormant giants across the globe. The planet trembled under massive earthquakes, and tsunamis surged forth, completing the Nordics' triad of destruction. Outside the safe cities, the unmarked survivors, those who'd escaped mCEL and the plague, faced a new nightmare. In Oregon, near the remnants of Portland, a farmer named Daniel Reese sprinted from his home as Mount Hood erupted with a deafening boom. The sky darkened instantly, ash raining down like black snow as lava spewed from the peak. He'd survived the vaccine by chance and the plague by isolation, but now the ground beneath him buckled. A 9.2 magnitude earthquake ripped through the Cascadia subduction zone, splitting the earth in jagged fissures. Daniel stumbled, his screams lost in the chaos as a wall of ash engulfed him, his unmarked wrist offering no protection against this elemental wrath. Across the Pacific, in Japan, the iconic Mount Fuji joined the chorus, its eruption painting the horizon red. Tokyo, already reeling from the plague, crumbled as skyscrapers toppled under a 9.6 magnitude quake. Survivors who'd fled to higher ground watched in horror as a tsunami, hundreds of feet high, barreled inland, swallowing entire districts. The wave carried debris and bodies, a churning tide of destruction that erased centuries of human achievement in minutes. The unmarked clung to rooftops and trees, only to be swept away as the Ring of Fire's fury spared no one. The eruptions weren't confined to the Pacific. In Italy, Vesuvius roared back to life, burying Naples in ash and pyroclastic flows, its wrath echoing the fate of Pompeii. Iceland's long-dormant volcanoes spewed lava across the island, while in Yellowstone, the supervolcano erupted with a force that shook the North American continent. Earthquakes rippled outward, 9.8 in California, 9.5 in Chile, toppling what little remained of civilization. Dormant peaks in the Andes, the Alps, and the Himalayas joined the chaos, their plumes merging into a global shroud of ash that choked the sky. In Colorado, Eli Rogers braced himself inside his bunker as the ground shuddered beneath him. The Rocky Mountains trembled with a 9.4 magnitude quake, cracks spidering through the earth. He'd avoided mCEL and the plague, but now the ring of fire's reach tested his sanctuary. Dust sifted through the ceiling as a nearby dormant volcano, long forgotten by locals, erupted, its ash seeping into his air filters. "Not like this," he growled, gripping his rifle as the bunker groaned. The radio, already faint, died entirely, leaving him isolated in a world tearing itself apart. In Safe City 17, Tommy Martinez stood frozen before the hub's screens, the feeds now a kaleidoscope of fire and ruin. The display showed Mount St. Helens erupting, its ash clouds swallowing Washington state. The camera shifted to Indonesia, where Krakatoa's explosion sent shockwaves through the air, followed by a tsunami that obliterated coastal villages. Tommy's hands shook, the memory of his mother's death blending with this new horror. "It's all gone," he whispered, his voice drowned by the gasps of others around him. A boy beside him sobbed as a feed from Chile showed Santiago collapsing under a quake, its survivors buried in rubble. Marcus Hawthorne, in Safe City 42, watched his wall-sized display with a detached awe. The Andes trembled before him, Popocatépetl in Mexico spewing lava across the landscape. The Ring of Fire's eruptions were a symphony of destruction, each volcano a note in the Nordics' apocalyptic score. He'd known their power since the Order's inception, but this surpassed even his darkest imaginings. A feed from Hawaii showed Kilauea and Mauna Loa erupting in tandem, lava flows consuming the islands as tsunamis crashed ashore. The counter on his display stalled, too many dead to tally, but he estimated another 500 million lost to this phase alone. "The planet's remaking itself," he murmured, his fingers steepled. The Nordics' technology had triggered this, not natural tectonics, but a deliberate activation of Earth's fault lines and magma chambers. The ash would cool the climate, the quakes would level infrastructure, and the tsunamis would erase coastal life. It was balanced through obliteration, and Marcus, despite his role as a chosen leader, felt the weight of its finality. In Safe City 9, Nolan Husk stood among a hushed crowd. The hubs displays a relentless barrage of catastrophe. Iceland's volcanoes painted the Arctic sky black, while a California feed showed San Francisco sinking as the San Andreas Fault unleashed a 9.9 magnitude quake. The Golden Gate Bridge twisted and fell, its wreckage swallowed by a tsunami surging from the Pacific. "They're targeting the Ring of Fire first," Nolan said, his voice steady despite the horror. 90% of the world's earthquakes, 75% of its volcanoes, it's a kill zone. The woman beside him, her sister lost to mCEL, stared as a Sydney feed showed a tsunami crashing through the Opera House, the harbor vanishing under frothing waves. "How many more?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Millions," Nolan replied, his mind racing. "The quakes and tsunamis will take what the eruptions don't." A Yellowstone feed flickered on, the supervolcano's plume rising miles into the atmosphere, ash spreading like a death shroud. The ground shook even here, the Safe City's alien engineering absorbing the tremors that ravaged the outside world. Beyond the sanctuaries, the unmarked fought a losing battle. In Peru, survivors of the plague fled Andean villages as Huascarán erupted, only to be crushed by landslides triggered by a 9.7 magnitude quake. In Indonesia, fishing communities vanished under tsunamis spawned by Sumatra's volcanic chain. The air grew toxic with ash and sulfur, choking those who dodged the initial blasts. Coastal cities, Los Angeles, Jakarta, Valparaiso, were erased, their populations drowned or buried as the earth convulsed. Eli's bunker held, but the tremors grew stronger, a nearby fault line splitting the mountains. He braced against a wall, the dim light flickering as ash clogged his vents. "Bastards," he spat, knowing the Nordics' reach extended even here. The unmarked outside his refuge, those few who'd survived mCEL and the plague, faced a tripled doom. Fire from above, quakes below, and waves from the sea. His radio silence was absolute, the world beyond a graveyard of ash and ruin. In the Safe Cities, the Chosen witnessed the planet's unraveling. Tommy curled into a ball, the display's glow a torment he couldn't escape. Marcus watched with a leader's resolve, mentally cataloging the Nordic strategy. Nolan stood transfixed, his intellect grappling with the scale. Billions dead from mCEL, a billion from the plague, and now hundreds of millions more as the Earth itself turned hostile. The hub's air thickened with despair, some Chosen screaming at the displays, others praying in languages the Nordics ignored. The third day wore on, the Ring of Fire's eruptions unrelenting. Volcanoes everywhere, Etna, Kilimanjaro, Shasta, joined the fray, their ash merging into a global pall. Earthquakes fractured continents, tsunamis redrew coastlines, and the unmarked dwindled further, their numbers slashed by a force no bunker or prayer could defy. The Nordics' silence persisted, their displays the only voice, showing a world being scoured clean for the chosen few who watched in helpless awe. The culling days ended as abruptly as they had begun, the Nordics' relentless phases. mCEL's nanotechnology, the engineered plague, and the Ring of Fire's cataclysm, silenced after a week of unrelenting devastation. On the seventh day, a stillness settled over the earth, its surface irrevocably altered by fire, ash, and flood. The skies, once choked with volcanic plumes and toxic haze, cleared with an eerie swiftness, as if the Nordics had flipped a cosmic switch. Brilliant blue stretched horizon to horizon, unmarred by clouds, the air crisp and clean, carrying the faint trill of birdsong, an incongruous melody over a planet reshaped into a graveyard. For the unmarked who'd survived, the emergence from their bunkers was a cautious, solitary affair. In Colorado, Eli Rogers pushed open the reinforced door of his mountain hideout, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The tremors had ceased, the ash no longer sifted through his vents, and the radio's static had given way to an unsettling quiet. He stepped into daylight, squinting against the sun's unfiltered glare. The landscape was unrecognizable, jagged peaks had crumbled, valleys were filled with volcanic debris, and the forest lay flattened, its trees charred or uprooted. Yet the sky above was a pristine azure, and a flock of sparrows darted overhead, their chirps a stark contrast to the desolation below. Eli inhaled deeply, the air tasting of renewal rather than ruin. "Too damn quiet," he muttered, scanning the horizon. No smoke rose, no distant screams echoed, just the wind whispering through the wreckage. He'd outlasted mCEL, the plague, and the quakes by sheer luck and preparation, but now isolation gripped him. The nearest town, once a 20-mile hike, was likely buried under ash or swallowed by a fault line. He was alone, one of perhaps a handful of unmarked left on a planet that felt hollowed out. The birds sang on, oblivious, their presence a cruel tease of life amidst the emptiness. Across the globe, other survivors emerged to similar scenes. In New Zealand, a fisherman named Hannah Ngata crawled from a coastal cave, her unmarked wrist trembling as she surveyed a shoreline redrawn by tsunamis. The ocean glittered under clear skies, its waves lapping at a beach littered with debris, boats, homes, bodies, but gulls wheeled above, their cries piercing the silence. In Siberia, a trapper named Yuri Volkov stepped from his underground shelter, the taiga around him leveled, yet the air rang with the chatter of finches. Each survivor faced a world both beautiful and desolate, their isolation a heavy price for enduring the Nordics' wrath. Inside the safe cities, the chosen awoke to a different reality. The holographic display that had broadcast the culling flickered off at dawn on the 8th day, replaced by a telepathic hum that seeped into their minds. In Safe City 17, Tommy Martinez stirred on his bed, his eyes fluttering open to a room bathed in soft light. His head felt strange, light, unburdened, as if a weight had been lifted. Memories of his mother, Sarah, flickered like half-remembered dreams, her face blurred, her voice muted. The pain of her death, once a sharp ache, had dulled to a vague sadness he couldn't fully grasp. He sat up, confused, his sigil glowing faintly on his wrist. A voice, not his own, resonated within him, calm and authoritative. "Your past has been re-engineered for your peace. You are a foundation for the new humanity. Live forward." Tommy frowned, rubbing his temples. He remembered being chosen, arriving here, but the details of the culling, the coughing sickness, the plague, the eruptions, slipped away like sand through his fingers. Around him, others in the hub stirred, their expressions mirroring his own. Bewilderment, a sense of loss they couldn't name. In Safe City 42, Marcus Hawthorne opened his eyes, his mind intact where others had been wiped. The Nordics had spared his memories, a privilege tied to his role as a leader. He sat at his desk, the wall-sized screen now blank, and felt the telepathic instructions settle into his consciousness. You will guide them. The past remains yours to bear. The weight of centuries, of the Order's manipulations, the culling's horrors, pressed against him, unsoftened by the re-engineering granted to most. He glanced at his sigil, its glow steady, and nodded to himself. Leadership was his burden, as it had always been. In Safe City 9, Nolan Husk awoke with his intellect preserved, another chosen leader exempt from the memory purge. The hub around him buzzed with quiet activity as others rose, their faces serene yet vacant. His mind buzzed with clarity, The archive in orbit, the Nordics' technology, the culling's phases. All intact, a gift and a curse. The telepathic voice confirmed his purpose. Your knowledge will shape their future. Lead with wisdom. He stood, his sigil pulsing, and surveyed the crowd. The woman who'd lost her sister to mCEL approached, her eyes soft, untroubled. I feel lighter, she said, her past erased. Nolan forced a smile, hiding the weight of what he still carried. The Nordics' guidance came next, broadcast to all chosen minds within the safe cities. The voice was precise, its commandments a framework for the new humanity. You will live in harmony with the earth. Population shall not exceed 500 million. Waste shall be minimal, resources shared. Conflict among you will invite our return. Learn from the past you are spared, and build anew. The words etched themselves into their re-engineered consciousness, a moral code enforced by the threat of another culling. In Safe City 17, Tommy joined a group gathering in the plaza, their faces reflecting a shared, vague optimism. A crystalline structure at the center hummed, and food dispensers activated, offering sustenance for their first day post-culling. Leaders, those like Marcus and Nolan, emerged among them, their intact memories a silent guide. Tommy ate quietly, the birdsong from outside filtering through the walls, a sound he couldn't place in his fragmented past. Marcus, in his chamber, reviewed the commandments mentally, his role clear. The safe cities would consolidate over time. The chosen taught sustainable living under Nordic oversight. He'd lead them through this infancy, his centuries of experience a tool to enforce the 500 million cap. The earth outside, he knew, was a blank slate, its cities gone, its population decimated, its ecosystems reset by alien hands. Nolan, in Safe City 9, addressed a small group, his voice steady. We start today, he said, gesturing to the crystalline walls. The Nordics have given us a chance, a clean earth, a new beginning. We'll learn their systems, use what I preserved in orbit, and build something lasting. His listeners nodded, their wiped minds eager for purpose, unaware of the billions lost to make this possible. Outside, Eli trudged through the ash-strewn mountains, his bunker's supplies slung over his back. The clear sky mocked him, its beauty a facade over a world stripped bare. He spotted a deer, unmarked, alive, bounding through the rubble, a sign life persisted beyond the Nordics' reach. Yet the silence of humanity pressed in, his isolation a mirror to the chosen's curated unity. Survive today, he told himself, figure out tomorrow later. The aftermath began with two humanities. The chosen, memory-wiped and guided within their sanctuaries, and the unmarked, scattered and alone under clear skies. The Nordics watched from unseen vantages, their commandments a leash on the future. The earth, scarred yet serene, waited for its next chapter, its appearance transformed, a testament to the culling's end and the fragile hope of what might rise from its ashes.